2025, because of course you could be watching this video way into the future. The start of 2025 here in Britain has been a cold one, but that's the way we like it, so it's all good. New year, new idea, although it's an idea I had before the start of the new year, and it's been an idea to do with my blue background videos. So I've got my green background videos. The ones that I've got a blue background to incorporate my faith into the discussion. There's still cultural history videos, very much so, but with that incorporation of my faith, Christianity, and really tips for an approach to studying those texts, if you're a Christian like myself, but also if you're somebody who simply wants to gain an understanding about those, very influential texts on everyone's life, especially here in the Western world. So yeah, did quite well there, quite a good sort of advertisement for the work I'm putting in. Okay, so what was my idea for my blue background videos? It's one I think that will be interesting and helpful. So since I've trained in cultural history, that's my academic background, I found that it can really open up the scriptures that I read as a Christian. I'm hoping I can convince you of how valuable that is by looking at sections of the Bible and hanging back to look at the historical, cultural landscape of that time, and to bring that into our reading, as in our understanding of the text we're reading. I'm going to start with New Testament examples, just because out of the Old and the New Testament has a more straightforward cultural landscape. Outside of the narrating culture, that's the Jewish and emerging Christian culture, there is one dominant prevailing culture throughout the Roman world in which everyone lives. That's a little less straightforward in the Old Testament. So the New Testament is a helpful place to get started. I certainly will look at Old Testament examples too. So in the Roman Empire, outside of the province of Judea, which, while it is Roman occupied and Roman ruled, does maintain a dominant Jewish culture, the dominant culture is Hellenistic. Hellenistic culture is so called because it's originated by Hellenes, who we often call the Greeks. Now, these don't have to be people from the Greek peninsula and the Aegean Islands, the Greece that we know today, but they're people spread out much further who do life the Hellenistic way. It's a cultural identity rather than a national identity. Interestingly, in the Bible, we see these people summarized as Greeks too. Again, they don't mean a specific nationality, but normally Greek speakers. The Romans are sometimes referred to as Greeks in the Bible, and what's meant by that is that they too are culturally Hellenistic. They had been for a long time, long before their empire building days. So we've got three chief distinguishing marks to sort of help us be grounded as we look at Hellenism, Hellenistic culture. Extremely complex, very interwoven with an awful lot of stuff, but let's ground ourselves with three chief distinguishing marks. The first one is organization into city-states, or polis, to use the Greek word for the city-state. Secondly, the organization of society into a very rigid social hierarchy, which is patriarchal. Men dominate, but not all men dominate. Democracy is birthed in ancient Greece. That's true. But at that time, democracy meant a kind of shared rule by all of the men who were of the top ruling class. Rule by the whole populace, including women, by consent is a modern development of that original ancient experiment of democracy. Okay, distinguishing mark number 3, the Hellenistic religion and cosmology. That's versions of the same pantheon of gods who the Greeks called the Olympians, they lived on Mount Olympus, and narratives about how their current world came to be, the cosmology. Important to note here in the 1st century is that while the religion and cosmology developed through the law of many centuries, they had been reviewed extensively by their famous philosophers, still famous now, over the last 5 centuries. So that's incorporated into people's understanding of themselves at the stage we're in here, the 1st century AD. So regarding this 3rd distinguishing mark, the Hellenistic cosmology and religion, just an important thing to keep in mind at all times. Everyone had an expectation of gods. I'm pointing this out because we as readers can very easily make the assumption that the Gentile world of the first century can be considered a replica, an equivalent of the societies and urban culture in which we live now. That's not correct, and we will do ourselves a favour trying to unlearn that assumption. I'm not saying commonalities can't be found, of course, but when those of us who are Christians communicate with our surrounding world today, it's not one that has an expectation of gods. If you live in a contemporary Western society, like I do, the average person you encounter is sceptical about the existence of gods, or they have decided there are no gods. That's not the same as the average person living in the Roman world in the first century. Even if a first century Hellenistic person became convinced that a particular god or pantheon of gods weren't real, they will still expect there to be other real gods. I'm talking about the average normal majority here. I'm not saying that there weren't people who didn't resemble atheists in this time. They were unique, peculiar individuals in their own times. Socrates, for instance, was accused of being an atheist, although that was more to say that he was godless in his attitude and behaviour. Going back to our average person on our average street, of course, there is also another common group that we come across, that is people who are already part of a faith group. So they do believe in a god or gods. Even these people, though, are not comparable to the first century people because they don't have that same expectation of gods. If the people of today's faith groups cease to believe in the faith that they were raised in, it's no assumption that they will conclude, well, there's another god or gods. They're more likely to abandon the practice of faith and be sceptical about the existence of gods. That's the default setting of our culture. Some of the reasons for that are quite complex and subculture specific, but also we don't need to do as much guesswork about daily phenomena as people once did. We know the reasons for stars in the sky and floods and illnesses. What we do have in common with those first century people is that if we didn't have a satisfactory explanation for those phenomena, we wouldn't be able to tolerate not knowing either. We would come up with working explanations, such as perhaps gods, like they did. That's the common thread of humanity, let's say. Sorry, long aside there, but important going forwards. So, we have two major cultures going on here, neither of which are the one that we know and live in. A particularly important individual for us, when we look at the New Testament, is one of the New Testament's most famous individuals, the Apostle Paul. This is because he really is a bridge between these two major cultures, the Jewish and the Hellenistic, and that's due to two aspects of his upbringing. Firstly, he was born and raised in Tarsus, which, by the way, today would be Western Turkey, and at this point his name isn't Paul, it's Saul. He's very much raised a Jew in a devout Jewish family, but living in a Hellenistic city, where the predominant everyday culture is Hellenistic. In terms of his Jewish upbringing, this is a very sincere and concentrated upbringing to the extent that he trained to become a Pharisee. And this training would have started at quite a young age. So first important aspect of his upbringing. Second important aspect. He was trained to become a Pharisee, as we've seen, and he's trained to become a Pharisee by a Pharisee called Gamaliel. Gamaliel was known for insisting on a full education for his students. Not just all of the Tanakh and Midrash teachings and practices, but a detailed understanding of the beliefs and cultures of those among whom Jews lived. So Paul was also learned in the pagan religion of Hellenism and the culture of its people. But this was beyond just sort of being informed, the kind of academic knowledge that he'd get from Gamaliel. It was also experiential learning. Paul understood what it was like for everyday people to live under their gods because he witnessed it among his fellow citizens. He saw what the impacts of that were on their practices and worldview. Now, in my view, that's a sort of aspect, actually, even in the secular world, when we study mythology, that we don't seem to look at as much. We're very interested in the stories but we don't maybe ask the question, which seems an obvious one to me. So people believe this stuff. What's that impact going to have on them, their mindset, their worldview every day? So partly what interests me in all this is also to look into those areas. A cultural historian, right? So it's no accident then that God sends Paul as the chief missionary to the Gentiles, to use the Jewish term, and that this role and authority are recognised in the early church. If you read about Paul's story of conversion, that's a remarkable story. But his ministry is quite logical. It uses his existing gifts. Important additional information, Paul was traditionally thought to be a bald man, so obviously that indicates a great amount of wisdom. So our focus text that we're studying today involves Paul, of course, and it's found in the book of Acts, chapter 14, and main focus is going to be verses 8 to 18, which I'm now going to read. Now, at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. That was Acts 14, verses 8 to 18. This passage from Acts is a good place to start this kind of study. It's a very obvious incident of a culture clash. Other passages we'll look at in the future are more subtle to us and they'd need more explanation. But here we have a very obvious cultural confusion resulting in a major incident. Two sets of people can witness the same thing but interpret it very differently. That's because none of us are a blank canvas. Each of us has our cultural identity that we project onto anything that we ever need to interpret, and that projection conditions our interpretation. That's no less true of us today than it is of the people in this story. Our interpretation of events here in Acts is certainly going to be closer to the Jewish interpretation, but it still isn't identical. If you're a contemporary Westerner like me, your culture and its norms are not present here in Acts 14, unless you assume them and project them onto the text. So, in this passage, missionary Paul with his companion missionary Barnabas are travelling to cities that are Hellenistic cities and spreading the message of the gospel, which is brand new to these people. They probably know of the God of the Jews and the Christians because the city of Jerusalem is a big famous presence in the Roman world. But they don't know that God or the core beliefs of Jews and Christians. Paul and Barnabas have been travelling to cities in the area that Rome had reorganised and now called Galatia. Check out the map here. They've been to two neighbouring major cities, Iconium and Derbe, and have just arrived in the third, Lystra. And I am totally guessing pronunciations, by the way. They're preaching the gospel on the streets of Lystra. That actually tells us that there wasn't a synagogue in Lystra. Paul has always gone to the synagogue first in every city. Here, the Jewish minority is so much of a minority that there isn't a synagogue. A city needed 10 Jewish men of certain standing to found a synagogue. There is a Jewish population in Lystra, we learn that later, but they haven't got the requisite number of these certain men to found an actual synagogue. In the absence of a synagogue, Paul and Barnabas go straight to the regular Gentile folk of Lystra, and they find a public spot to start preaching. Doing this is risky. Paul and Barnabas barely escaped Iconium with their lives. You can see that in the earlier part of Acts 14. It's not against the law to preach publicly. It's quite a common thing, but there are always groups that personally object, who stir up negativity against Paul and Barnabas. At this particular place is a man who has never had the use of his legs. Even in our time, there are many reasons why that occurs from birth. But in the first century, there were many more reasons. Birth was a very risky time. There's no state support for disabled people, and in the case of pagan cities like Lystra, the reason may partly be because they are thought to be the responsibility of a god. The great volcano god, Hephaestus, himself had a physical disability. Or Asclepius was the god of healing, although in some stories he was already slain by Zeus, so he might not be on the scene at this time. Some people may need to be diseased in order to appease Theseus, the god of disease, so that he doesn't afflict the whole city with disease. If a disabled person was thought to be the property of a god, it may have been thought wise not to interfere.